Welcome to our first video lecture on human-computer interaction 2. I'd like to introduce myself again. I'm Naphtali Rowe III and I'll be your instructor for this subject. To start with, I'd like to give credits to Dix, Finlay, Abowd and Beale on their provision of this learning material based on their book Human-Computer Interaction 3rd edition. After this introduction, I'll be turning off my camera so that you can see the full details of the slide provided. And of course, if you have comments, and suggestions, and questions regarding the topics that I'll be discussing with you today, you are hereby requested to comment it down below. I'd gladly appreciate it. Okay? So let's start. So for this video lecture, we will be dealing with interaction models. But to be as clear as possible, this particular module is divided into four. We have interaction models, ergonomics, interaction styles, and context. But to make this video lecture comprehensive, brief, and short, I'll be discussing muna interaction models. Okay? So let's start. What is interaction? So by definition, based on computing domains, interaction is basically the communication created between the user and the system through a particular interface. We learned in HCI 1 that a successful interaction relies on how effective the interface translates the interaction between the two. Okay? Now, to better understand, we have here some subtopics which includes terms of interaction, the Norman model, and of course the interaction framework. So let's start first with the terms of interaction. There are three terms that you need to remember as we go on with our discussion. These are domain, goal, and then task. Domain is the area of work under study. This is considered as the field in which one is interested to work with. Experts became experts not because they know everything but because they are master of certain domain. So for example, we have here graphic design. Now, if you are passionate enough in creating contents using media, then graphic design will be or can be your area of expertise or domain. Okay? Now, when you say goal, this is on the other hand talks about the desired output. Goals are particularly specific. So, for example, uh, as a graphic design or a graphic design enthusiast, you would want to achieve something. And of course, an example for that one is creating a solid red triangle. So, if you notice, that's your goal and it's very specific. The next term is what you call tasks. These are operations to manipulate the concepts of a domain. This involves action and at the same time a step-by-step procedure. So an example of tasks is selecting fill tool and then clicking over a triangle shape. Since our goal or in order for the goal to be realized, they need to do it or perform a specific step to create it. So by selecting a fill tool and then clicking over a triangle, that would mean that they can create a solid red triangle. So if you notice, the domain, the goal, and the tasks are interrelated. Okay? Now let's go to Donald Norman's model. So basically, the Norman's model of interaction is the most influential in human computer interaction. This is because of its closeness to our intuitive understanding of interaction between human, user, and computer. Intuitive means using based on what one feels to be true even without conscious reasoning. It is sometimes associated with the word instinctive. Okay, that's where Donald Norman's model uh, works around. Okay, so Norman's model can be divided actually into two major phases. The first one is what you call execution. The second one is evaluation. And then these major phases are represented by specific 7 stages. And then generally, the model concentrates on the user's view of the interface. So these 7 stages are actually part of the two major phases, which is the execution and then evaluation. So the next slide, you are then provided, so this is what I was explaining a while ago. So the illustration presented presents the iterative process of which involve 4 factors, namely goal, execution, system, and evaluation. I mentioned the word iterative, it's because this one will be done like multiple times provided na the evaluation and execution was performed accordingly based on goal and of course presented by the system. More of this will be discussed on the succeeding slide. Okay, let's start to decipher what this model or what these stages mean in human-computer interaction. So the first is the user will form a goal. This is the user's notion of what needs to be done. Since most goals are created through liable but still imprecise, therefore it needs to be translated into a specific intention and the actual actions that will reach the goal before it can be executed by the user. The user perceives the new state of the system and then after the execution of the action sequence and interprets it in the terms of his expectations. If the system is if the system state reflects the user's goal, then the computer has done what he wanted and the interaction has been successful. Otherwise, the user must formulate a new goal and repeat the cycle. If you notice, the repeating pattern or the repeat process is what you call iterative. Let's have switching on the light to better understand the cycle. For example, your goal is to turn on the light. So that's your goal. Now, your intention is to switch on the light yourself or ask maybe someone to do it. And of course, you'll then perceive the result and then you will ask yourself, did it turn on? And of course, you will do the interpretation. So if the room has more light, so for example, that's your interpretation. And then for the evaluation, whether the goal was achieved if you have successfully turned on the light. So those are, or that's an example of uh, execution and then evaluation. Turning on the light and then whether you turn it yourself, that could be your intention, or asking someone else to do it. Perceiving the result means answering the question, did it turn on? And of course, the interpretation part means that you are able to observe that the room has more light. Okay? And then for the evaluation, you need to understand whether the goal was achieved by understanding that the light was turned on because you were able to feel it or see it. If not, then either you create another goal or change the intention and repeat the cycle. Now, using Norman's model, some systems are harder to use than the others. So we have here 2 factors that is to be considered whenever we use Norman's model. So the first one is gulf of execution. Gulf of execution is the degree of ease with which a user can understand the current state of a system. It is the difference between the intentions of the users and what the system allows them to do. For example, a person can look at the light switch and easily tell what the current state of the system. For example, whether the light is on or off and how to operate the switch. This means that the gulf of execution is small. Norman states that in order to design the best interfaces, the gulf must be kept as small as possible. So if you notice in our example earlier, like turning on the light using the switch, if you notice that the process or the actions involved is quite small, and then of course the result is as immediate as possible. Okay, so according to Norman Dow, it should be that when you design interfaces, this particular gulf of execution must be kept as small as possible. Okay, number two, we have the gulf of evaluation. The gulf of evaluation is the degree of ease with which a user can perceive and interpret whether or not the action they performed was successful. The gulf is small when the system provides information about its state in a form that is easy to receive, interpret, and matches the way the person thinks of the system. Let's now consider the same light switch example. If a person looks at the light, the gulf of evaluation is very small since with one switch, the user will immediately know if their action was successful. An example of the counterpart or the other way around, or an example of a large gulf of execution, is when an application has a spinning wheel to show a loading state after the user performs an action. The wheel alone is not enough for the user to interpret the progress that the system is making in response to their action. The gulf can be shortened by having a loading bar instead. So anong ibig sabihin ni gulf of evaluation? Si gulf of evaluation focuses on the result. Okay? So if you notice, yung first example natin is turning on the light using a switch. So after turning on or turning on the switch and then having perceived that the light has turned on, automatically the user was provided with the result na okay, the light was already turned on. But if the gulf of execution is large, it means that the user will have either a hard time or a longer time to interpret the result of a particular action that is being executed. For example, there are some computer applications that still uses a spinning wheel, yung parang umiikot na gulong to indicate na the system or the application is loading. Now, the with that kind of interface, the user will think of what's with this particular interface. Okay? Throughout the time, maybe he will understand that it's loading or it's still doing some things on the background. But, of course, on its first hand, the user will not understand like, para saan ba itong spinning wheel na ito. Okay? Now, technically, the spinning wheel is indicates that there is something happening and the result will be showed later. But then again, with this kind of process, you are then presenting a large gulf of evaluation. So to address this one, you can then use a progress bar that indicates both the action of progress and of course the number corresponding to the progress. So instead of using the spinning wheel, yung gagamitin mo na lang is yung progress bar para alam ni user na okay, there is something happening in the background. I will not have the result yet and I still need to wait because the status bar or the progress bar indicates na it's still 50%. You see? So compare natin yung spinning wheel tapos yung progress bar. The more informative one is of course the progress bar. Okay? So just to make it short or just to make it as clear as possible, pag sinasabi nating gulf of execution, we are to narrow down the steps that will be used in order to have the result, and yung gulf of execution naman is providing a result that the user can interpret as early as possible. Hindi na kinakailangan na mag-isip pa ni user. na medyo complicated. Okay? So that's for gulf of execution and gulf of evaluation. Now, we have here broadening of concepts in terms of, since we were talking about some errors and mistakes, right? So, human errors can be considered into or can be classified into two. Technically, it can be considered as a slip, or the other one is mistake. Now, slip is that on the context of computers or computing domain, you understand fully the system. It's just that you manipulate, use, or utilize it incorrectly. But you were able to correct your action later on the process. Mistake, on the other hand, is that you don't have any knowledge on the system, how to do and use it. And then, for example, you saw a magnifying glass icon and you thought it's for search function, but instead, it's used to magnify the text. Slips can be addressed by improving the screen design, while mistake can be corrected by the provision of an in-depth training with the user who's using the system. Okay? So again, let's try to explain slip and mistake. Si slip daw, according to computing domain, si slip daw is that the user has the idea on how to use the system. Pero nagkamali lang siya, lang, like for example, nagkamali lang siya kung anong pipindutin. Nagkamali lang siya sa keyword na kanyang gagamitin. But later on, the user was able to correct it because he or she knows how to do it correctly. Now, when you say mistake naman is that wala kayong alam or wala kang alam on how to do the system or how to use the system, but still you did it and then you end up having a bad result. Okay? Now, to address the slips and mistake, si slip is that either there should be a better screen design so that the user will not be uh, having some errors on his end. And for mistake naman is that the user should be immersed and then fully trained before using the system. Okay, that's how you address this kind of problems. Now let's go to Abowd and Beale framework. So actually, Abowd and Beale framework, this is actually an extension of Norman's model. So nagawa ito because of Norman's model. So Norman's model, if you notice, is only focused on the interface. That's why a new framework by Abowd and Beale was created and being utilized to address other factors in HCI. This framework attempts to deal with the system's communication through the interface. This framework also is therefore not a replacement but rather an extension of Norman's model. It means na the Abowd and Beale will not be effective if you don't know how to if you don't have any idea on what's going on with Norman model. It's because Abowd and Beale framework was created using Norman's model. Now let's try to understand this one. So if you notice, we have here ilan ba yung factors dito or entities na involved dito. You have the user, which is represented by U, and S is for the system. Now, to better explain this one, we have here the user begins with the formulation of a goal and task dito. Ito yun. In order to manipulate the machine or system, the task must be articulated between or within the input language. So yung kayang i-understand ng computer natin. The input language is then translated into the core language in the form of operations. Ayan, dito yan. Performed by the system. So ayan. So coming from user, interpreted by an interface, and then performed by the system. So the system then transforms itself as an output to be observed and evaluated by the user. The user then decides and assesses the results based on the goal, which then ends the cycle. So let's now try to understand again. So sabi daw dito, si user yung unang gumagawa ng goal and then he or she translate it or inputs it in the system or in a particular machine, and then the machine will try to translate it in a manner that the system will understand or perform. Okay, the system will then provide a display output, and then uh, the system will present an output, and then the user will try to observe and interpret whether ito ba yung hinahanap ko, ito ba yung gusto kong gagawin. Okay, so that's it, 'di ba? It's still quite user perspective, but then meron na siyang involvement ng mga interfaces. Okay, now the user intentions accordingly is translated. You have it here from the model itself. You have here 1, 2, 3, 4, di ba? We have translated into actions, translated into alterations, reflected in the output, and of course, interpreted by the user. Ito yung mga major activities involved based on the model presented earlier. So from the model, we learned that the intentions of the user needs to be translated into actions on a particular interface. These translated actions will trigger the change of the system, and then an output will be provided by the system in the form of display in order for the user to know whether his intentions were clear enough that the system was able to do it. The process of determining the correctness of the result will be dependent on the interpretation of the user. So, balikan natin si Abowd. A while ago, I mentioned na, you have it here, di ba? So, after the articulation and then the performance, the system was able to present a particular output. Ayan. Now, if you notice, this particular output is not directly accepted by the user, but rather it's observed first and then perceive, and then the user will try to evaluate whether the particular output was the particular output met the goal being that the user would want to achieve by the end of the cycle. So, if it's already a good output, then ibig sabihin tatanggapin niya ni user. If it's not a good uh, output, it would mean that the user will adjust himself with regards to the input he or she provided to the computing machine. Okay? So if you notice, it's still an iterative process or paulit-ulit, but then again, it's based on how the user and the system communicates with each other. The user provides the input, the system provides the output, and of course, the user perceives the output and then determines whether if this output is correct or not. Okay? So, for our next session, it will be an online session. I'll be talking about ergonomics and its what do you call this one? Its concepts. Okay, it will mainly revolve around the physical aspects of interfaces and of course the very famous industrial phases. So I'd like to uh, apologize again for not having to meet you last week, and I do hope na we can meet this week. And again, if you have any questions and comments, you can comment it down below, and I'll be happy to assist you with it. Thank you so much, guys, for joining me today, and of course, stay safe.